You can never foresee what will happen when the cage doors close in a sport like mixed martial arts. In this video, we'll look at boxers who were able to quiet their detractors and stun the entire world. Here are 10 warriors who disproved their naysayers, listed in no particular sequence. Without further ado. Number 10. Nate Diaz versus Conor McGregor 1. Back in 2016, when Conor McGregor's original opponent Rafael dos Anjos pulled out of their UFC 196 showdown due to injury, many felt that his replacement, Nate Diaz, would do little more than serve as a punching bag for the heavily favored Irishman. After all, Conor McGregor was undefeated in the UFC, had just beaten the legendary Jose Aldo, and had been actively training for the event. Conversely, Nate Diaz was stepping in on just 2 weeks' notice and had been on vacation prior to the call, making him a sizable underdog. During the opening round, McGregor was finding Diaz's chin with ease, but the Stockton native showed his durability. And in the second round, once he sensed that Conor McGregor was slowing down, he began to turn up the heat, putting pressure on McGregor like no one had ever done. This caused McGregor to shoot in for a desperate takedown, which led to the perfect opening for Diaz to secure a fight-ending choke. On that day, the world of MMA was shaken to its core, and finally, the younger Diaz brother had become a household name. Number 9. Rose Namajunas vs Joanna Jedrzejczyk 1. When they first met at UFC 217, Rose Namajunas versus Joanna Jedrzejczyk seemed to be a pretty straightforward showdown of striker versus grappler. Of course, very few thought that Rose Namajunas stood a chance against the dominant strawweight champion and was labeled as a plus 400 underdog. Joanna, at the time, was quickly becoming one of the pound-for-pound best, with 5 title defenses under her belt. And while Namajunas was certainly a creative and dangerous threat, most agreed that her best shot at winning was to get the fight to the ground. On fight night, however, Thug Rose showed absolutely no interest in the takedown. Out of nowhere, in one of the opening exchanges, she dropped Joanna to the canvas, before then repeating the feat a minute later to eventually score the finish. It's not that anyone thought that Namajunas was a bad fighter, but to go out there and outstrike someone like Joanna was pretty remarkable. Number 8. Aljamain Sterling versus Petr 2. It was hard not to feel a bit of satisfaction when Aljamain Sterling scored a legitimate but still quite narrow decision over Pierre January. The first time they shared the octagon, Jan had a pretty comfortable lead over Sterling before he landed the illegal knee that brought the bout to its end. Sure, Sterling technically won the belt via disqualification, but most people still saw Petr as the true bantamweight champion. Given how the first fight went, most people were convinced that order would be restored at 135 pounds once Petr had his chance at revenge. However, this time around, many made the mistake of underestimating Sterling. And sure enough, when fight night came around, he used his wrestling and powerful top control to steal 3 of the 5 rounds on the judges' scorecards, winning the bout to retain his title. Sure, he isn't the most popular fighter on the roster, but he has undoubtedly solidified his place as bantamweight champion. Number 7. Cody Garbrandt vs Dominic Cruz. Fights are not won and lost on the microphone, but judging by the pre-fight media buildup, it seemed like Dominic Cruz was living rent-free in Cody Garbrandt's head. Heading into their title bout at UFC 207, it felt like this was definitely a premature title shot for this young prospect. After all, he had only been in the UFC for 2 years and hadn't beaten anyone in the top 5. Sure, he was athletic and had knockout power, but going up against the legendary movement and fight IQ of Cruz, most assumed that this Team Alpha male member would fall short, just like his teammates before him. But then fight night came around and Dominic Cruz, one of the greatest creative strikers of all time, was thoroughly outclassed by the younger challenger, losing a lopsided decision. Cody Garbrandt may have fallen on hard times recently, but his performance at UFC 207 was truly something to behold. Number 6. Leon Edwards versus Kamaru Usman 2. Heading into their rematch at UFC 278, almost no one was giving Leon Edwards a chance at defeating Kamaru Usman, especially after he lost their initial bout in 2015. Sure, both Leon Edwards and Kamaru Usman had shown a lot of improvement since their first meeting, but it was clear that Usman had outpaced Edwards, not only becoming the second greatest welterweight champion, but also securing his place as the pound-for-pound best. While Leon Edwards had a solid opening round, Kamaru Usman dominated him for the majority of the bout, and as the fight wore on, it seemed like he was fading. Even the commentary team of Joe Rogan and Daniel Cormier started to wonder out loud if Edwards was just hoping to survive. But then, Leon Edwards pulled off a movement worthy of his nickname, kicking Usman right to the head and finishing him with a clean knockout. Safe to say, he silenced any doubters with his massive victory. And number 5. Stipe Miocic with Francis Ngannou 1. For once, it wasn't the challenger who was doubted here, but instead the champion Stipe Miocic. When they first met in 2018, Francis Ngannou was the UFC's ticket to having a Mike Tyson-esque heavyweight champion, a ferocious knockout artist who fought the part and looked the part. During the lead-up, Dana White could barely contain his excitement as he hyped up the insane punching power of the heavyweight challenger. But across from him was the champion, Stipe Miocic, someone who had successfully defended the belt twice and who was about to break the record for most consecutive defenses in the heavyweight division. Despite his solid resume, the promotion was clearly backing Francis Ngannou. But when the two finally met in the cage, Stipe escaped a tough first round and put an absolute clinic on the Predator. Sure, Ngannou would eventually rise up and defeat him at a later date, but at UFC 220, Stipe was the one who came out on top. Number 4. Juliana Peña's Amanda Nunes won. On paper, Juliana Peña didn't seem to have any real route to victory against Amanda Nunes, or at least that's what we thought heading into UFC 269. At the time, Amanda Nunes was and still is the pound-for-pound queen, a powerful, technical, and unstoppable finisher who had ran through some of the greatest female fighters in the sport. Yet somehow, despite her wins over the likes of Cris Cyborg, Holly Holm, Ronda Rousey, and Valentina Shevchenko, it was Juliana Peña who would end her historic reign. While the champion got off to a solid start, Juliana Peña kept the pressure on, finding a home for her jab as the lioness slowly began to fade. By the midway point of round 2, Amanda Nunes was clearly exhausted and eventually gave up a huge takedown to the challenger, who cinched in a rear naked choke just moments later. Out of all the fighters mentioned on this list, there's a good chance that Juliana Peña was the most unlikely winner of them all. Number 3. Michael Bisping's Luke Rockhold 2. Not only was Michael Bisping a short-notice replacement when he finally received his first shot at UFC Gold, but he was also coming up against a guy who had thoroughly dominated him when they first fought. Heading into UFC 199, Luke Rockhold had an aura of invincibility about him, especially after finishing the previously undefeated Chris Weidman for the belt. Although Michael Bisping was a respectable fighter with some solid wins on his record, few people, if any, gave him a realistic chance of defeating Luke Rockhold. After all, Bisping had lost their first bout, was 37 years old, and appeared to be on his way out, while Rockhold was in the prime of his career. So when Bisping caught him with a clean left hook in the opening round before then finishing the champion to claim the title, it was one of the most unbelievable moments in UFC history. A massive underdog win, but also a late career surge for someone who had been unfairly written off. Number 2. Matt Serra's George Street Pierre I. By the time George Street Pierre rose up to become the UFC welterweight champion, the world was convinced that he would rule over the division for quite some time. But MMA, as we all know, is a wild sport, and when the UFC decided to add a comeback theme to their latest season of The Ultimate Fighter, it was certainly an interesting choice. So when Matt Serra became the welterweight winner, he earned the opportunity to face off against George Street Pierre. While he was viewed as a decent fighter with a 9-4 record, he had lost 3 of his last 6 bouts, and almost no one thought he could actually defeat GSP. Of course, Serra shocked the world by stunning the champion in the opening round. Not only did he have Street Pierre in trouble early on, but he then went on to finish the future legend via TKO. Sure, Street Pierre rallied and thoroughly dominated him in the rematch, but as far as upset victories go, Matt Serra's shocking win over this pound-for-pound great left all of his doubters in shock. Number 1. Holly Holm's Ronda Rousey. And finally, we come to perhaps the biggest shock of all. We certainly knew that Holly Holm had a substantial boxing background prior to her time in MMA. But coming up against the seemingly unstoppable Ronda Rousey, it seemed as though she was destined to become another name on the champion's resume. After all, Ronda Rousey was undefeated, had secured 6 title defenses in the UFC, and had finished all but one of her opponents in the first round. But when those cage doors shut, all our expectations were turned on their head. Holly started to outmaneuver the champion from the get-go without really taking any damage in return. In the second round, it was clear that Holly Holm had an advantage on the feet, and after staggering Ronda, she followed it up with a massive head kick, knocking out the legendary champion there and then. Needless to say, most of us were left totally speechless. As always, if you guys enjoyed the video, please be sure to let me know by leaving a like and subscribing to our channel. Apart from that, thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.